This is offline, connected overnight. Tonight's reading, the 1971 Hare Krishna Airport operation, documented by Robert Cialdini. 75 minutes. Put this on while you sleep, while you drive, or while you wind down. Let your attention come and go. In the autumn of 1971, teams of saffron-robed members of the International Society for Krishna Consciousness established what would become one of the most systematically studied influence operations in the history of applied social psychology. Their venue was Los Angeles International Airport. Their instrument was a carnation. ISKCON had been founded 5 years earlier, in 1966, in a rented storefront on 2nd Avenue in Manhattan's Lower East Side. Its founder was Abhay Karavana Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, a 70-year-old Bengali monk who had arrived in New York in September 1965 aboard the cargo ship Jaladuta, carrying 40 rupees in cash and a crate of the Sanskrit text he had spent 3 decades translating into English. Prabhupada had been born Abhay Charanda in Calcutta in 1896, had trained as a chemist and pharmaceutical manager under British colonial administration, and had been formally initiated into the Gaudiya, the Vaishnava tradition, in 1933 by his guru Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, who charged him with carrying Vedic knowledge to the English-speaking world. It took Prabhupada 3 decades to begin fulfilling that instruction. When he finally reached New York in 1965, he was among the oldest men on record to found a new religious movement from scratch in a foreign country. ISKCON's theological orientation drew from the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition, a devotional current within Hinduism centered on the worship of Krishna as the supreme manifestation of the divine, revived in the 16th century by the Bengali Saint Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, who was born in Navadvip in 1486. Chaitanya's central practice was Sankirtan, collective public singing of Krishna's names, which he taught as the primary spiritual discipline appropriate to the present cosmic age, the Kali Yuga. Prabhupada imported this practice directly into ISKCON's public presence. The robed devotees chanting the Hare Krishna mantra in airports, parks, and city streets that became the movement's most visible American phase from 1967 through the late 1970s were performing a practice with a 5th-century Gaudiya theological pedigree. By 1970, ISKCON had established functioning temples in New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Boston, London, Amsterdam, and Hamburg. The movement had attracted several thousand initiated devotees, predominantly young Americans from middle-class backgrounds who had come of age during the counterculture and found in ISKCON a structured alternative to both mainstream American life and the disorganized spirituality of the broader hippie milieu. The sociologist E. Burke Rockford Jr., who conducted field work within ISKCON communities beginning in 1975 and published his findings as Hare Krishna in America in 1985, the most methodologically rigorous sociological study of the movement during the airport operation period, documented that many early ISKCON members were former participants in drug culture who experienced conversion as a decisive break with addiction. ISKCON required strict vegetarianism, celibacy outside marriage for initiated householders, and the complete avoidance of intoxicants, including caffeine and alcohol. The movement offered structure at a moment when many young Americans were experiencing the costs of its absence. The movement's revenue requirements grew in proportion to its institutional ambitions. Prabhupada's central publishing project, the Bhaktivedanta Book Trust, incorporated formally in 1972, required capital for printing and global distribution at a scale that street corner collections could not sustain. Prabhupada's broader vision encompassed a network of rural farm communities across the United States, a major temple complex in the Vrindavan district of India, and the worldwide distribution of his translated Vedic texts in volumes sufficient to reach every public library on earth. These ambitions required consistent, scalable revenue. The critical operational innovation emerged through empirical trial rather than strategic design. ISKCON's primary fundraising practice through the late 1960s had been direct solicitation. Devotees approached pedestrians and asked for donations. Return rates were modest and inconsistent. At some point between 1969 and 1971, according to accounts compiled by Rockford from interviews with senior ISKCON members, a devotee discovered that presenting a small gift before the solicitation request substantially increased both the probability of a donation and the amount given. The norm that ISKCON's airport operation exploited had been under scientific examination for decades before the first carnation was placed in a traveler's hand at Los Angeles International. To understand the mechanism's resilience, why it functioned consistently against a target population that, by the mid-1970s, frequently knew exactly what was being done to them, it is necessary to trace the intellectual architecture of reciprocity research through the 20th century. The anthropological foundation was laid by Marcel Mauss, the French sociologist born in 1872, who spent the bulk of his career at the École Pratique de Hautes Études in Paris. Mauss was the nephew and primary intellectual heir of Emile Durkheim, and his approach combined Durkheim's sociological method with extensive comparative ethnography drawn from Polynesian, Melanesian, and Northwestern American indigenous societies. His 1925 monograph, Say, Sur Loudon, translated into English by Ian Cunnison as The Gift in 1954, examined gift exchange across multiple traditional societies. Mauss analyzed most extensively the potlatch ceremonies of the Kwakwaka'wakw peoples of the Pacific Northwest Coast and the Kula Ring exchanges of the Melanesian Trobriand Islands. The latter, documented by Bronislaw Malinowski in his 1922 Argonauts of the Western Pacific. Mauss's central argument was that gift-giving in pre-commercial societies was never truly voluntary. It operated under a threefold obligatory structure: the obligation to give, the obligation to receive, and the obligation to repay. The third obligation, the repayment, was the structural mechanism that generated social cohesion and economic exchange in societies without formal contract law or currency systems. The gift, in Mauss's analysis, was a binding instrument, not a free act. The apparent generosity of the giver was simultaneously a claim on the receiver. The cross-cultural universality of this mechanism was addressed by Alvin Goldner, the sociologist at Washington University in St. Louis, in his 1960 paper, The Norm of Reciprocity, a preliminary statement published in the American Sociological Review. Goldner argued that reciprocity was a universal norm, identifiable across every examined human society, that served as a starting mechanism for social interaction in the absence of pre-established role relationships. The norm had two functional components: give benefits to those who have benefited you, and do not injure those who have benefited you. Goldner's paper became one of the most cited works in mid-century American sociology, because it connected Mauss's comparative anthropological evidence with the structural functionalist framework then dominant in American academic departments. It also, crucially, identified the norm as operating through the emotion of indebtedness, a feeling that Goldner described as functional precisely because it was aversive. The discomfort of indebtedness motivated action to discharge the debt. The airport traveler holding an unsolicited carnation was experiencing, in Goldner's framework, the beginning of an indebtedness that the social environment would pressure them to resolve. The evolutionary grounding for reciprocity as a universal behavioral disposition came from Robert Trivers, an evolutionary biologist at Harvard University, who published The Evolution of Reciprocal Altruism in the Quarterly Review of Biology in January 1971. The same year that ISKCON's carnation operations were beginning at Los Angeles International. Trivers' model, built on game-theoretic principles derived in part from John von Neumann and Oscar Morgenstern's 1944 theory of games and economic behavior, demonstrated that reciprocal altruism, giving with the implicit expectation of return, was evolutionarily stable in populations with repeated interactions among recognizable individuals. The cheater detection mechanism Trivers described, by which individuals who fail to reciprocate are identified and excluded from future cooperative exchanges, provided the evolutionary pressure that made the reciprocity norm both psychologically deep and emotionally salient. Failure to reciprocate had, across evolutionary time, activated genuine social costs, ostracism and exclusion from resource-sharing networks that track survival probability. The airport traveler was not simply violating an etiquette rule when they failed to reciprocate. They were triggering a response system calibrated by millions of years of selection for cooperative behavior. The experimental translation of this evolutionary logic into laboratory psychology came from Dennis Reagan, a social psychologist at Cornell University, who published the most directly relevant experimental study in 1971 in the Journal of Experimental Social Psychology, in a paper titled Effects of a Favor and Liking on Compliance. Reagan's experimental design involved a Confederate who provided an unsolicited Coca-Cola to a research subject during a supposed art evaluation task, then later made a request for the subject to purchase raffle tickets. Subjects who had received the unrequested soft drink purchased significantly more tickets than those in the control condition. Not merely more in proportion to the value of the soft drink, but more in absolute dollar terms than the drink had cost. The reciprocity effect generated a net transfer to the Confederate that exceeded the value of the initial gift. The finding most directly relevant to the ISKCON case was Reagan's discovery that the reciprocity effect was statistically independent of the subject's reported liking for the Confederate. Reagan measured subjects' attitudes toward the Confederate on multiple dimensions after the interaction and found that subjects who reported actively disliking the Confederates still purchased more raffle tickets if they had received the Coca-Cola. The normative obligation to reciprocate was not filtered through interpersonal effect. This result had a direct operational implication for ISKCON's airport teams. A target who received a carnation and simultaneously felt irritated by the encounter, suspicious of the organization, and consciously resistant to the solicitation was still subject to the behavioral pull of the reciprocity norm. The feeling and the behavior were being processed through different psychological systems, and the norm was capable of influencing behavior through the social compliance route, even while the deliberative route was generating active resistance. Cialdini, in Chapter 2 of Influence, The Psychology of Persuasion, published by William Morrow in 1984, synthesized this experimental and theoretical literature into his analysis of the ISKCON case. He introduced the reciprocity norm as the first and most powerful of the 6 weapons of influence he had identified across his years of field observation. The other 5, commitment and consistency, social proof, authority, liking, and scarcity, followed in subsequent chapters. But reciprocity was positioned first because Cialdini had concluded, from both field observation and a comprehensive survey of the experimental literature, that it was the most reliably activatable at the lowest cost with a minimum of target preparation. The ISKCON operation exemplified this combination. The gift cost pennies, required no prior relationship with the target, and triggered a behavioral response that functioned independently of attitude. What ISKCON had discovered empirically, through years of field iteration across multiple airport environments and tens of thousands of individual encounters, was the precise activation sequence. The gift had to precede the request. The gift had to be presented as given, not as a loan or a sample subject to return. The gift had to enter the recipient's physical possession before the solicitation occurred. Each of these operational conditions mapped directly onto the experimental parameters that Reagan's 1971 study had identified as necessary for the reciprocity effect to activate at full strength. The devotees, operating with no knowledge of Reagan's laboratory, had reverse-engineered his findings from field outcomes. By 1973, ISKCON's airport Sankirtana teams were operating at more than a dozen major American airports. The roster included O'Hare International in Chicago, John F. Kennedy International and LaGuardia Airport in the New York metropolitan area, Hartsfield Atlanta Municipal Airport, Dallas Love Field, and Miami International. Dallas Fort Worth International, which opened in January 1974 to replace Love Field as the primary hub for North Texas air traffic, was incorporated into the operation within months of its opening. Each new airport represented not merely a geographic expansion, but an additional deployment of the same calibrated operational sequence, validated by 3 years of field testing at the original Los Angeles site. The organizational structure behind these operations was considerably more systematic than the informal appearance of rogue figures with flower baskets suggested. Each ISKCON temple maintaining an airport operation employed a Sankirtana captain, typically a senior devotee with a demonstrated record of high collection totals, who was responsible for coordinating team logistics, tracking daily and weekly donation tallies by team and by individual devotee, and managing supply procurement. The sociologist Larry Shin of Denison University, whose 1987 book, The Dark Lord, Cult Images and the Hare Krishnas in America drew on field work, court documents, and internal ISKCON correspondence, documented that individual devotees were assigned daily collection quotas and that their standing within the temple community was directly correlated with their Sankirtana performance. High performers received public recognition within the temple, additional operational resources, and in some cases leadership advancement. Consistent underperformers were assigned additional spiritual exercises or transferred to different teams or locations. The logistical requirements were substantial and were managed through standing commercial relationships. ISKCON temples in cities with airport operations maintained accounts with regional wholesale flower distributors. Fresh carnations were ordered daily and delivered to temple facilities, then transported to airports in quantities calibrated to team size and shift length. The cost per carnation at wholesale in 1973 ranged from 2 to 4 cents, depending on season and regional market conditions. A team of 6 devotees working a full 8-hour shift at a major hub airport could distribute 300 to 500 flowers, at an average donation yield of approximately $1 per successful contact, a figure derived from Rockford's fieldwork interviews with devotees and from partial financial records that entered the public domain through subsequent litigation. The gross revenue per team per day ranged from $150 to $400. Net of flower cost, transportation, and incidental expenses, the operating margin was substantial by the standards of charitable solicitation. ISKCON's approach to target selection within airport terminals was not random, though it was not codified in formal written protocols that have survived in fully accessible form. Rockford's fieldwork interviews with experienced Sankirtana devotees established that teams had developed informal screening criteria through accumulated field experience. The characteristics prioritized by experienced teams converged across different temples and different airports, suggesting independent empirical derivation rather than centralized instruction. Travelers who were alone were strongly preferred over those in groups. The explanation for this preference connects to the social dynamics of normative pressure under observation. A solo traveler who received a flower and felt the pull of the reciprocity norm had no companion to consult, no partner to signal that the encounter was suspect, and no group identity to maintain by demonstrating noncompliance. A traveler accompanied by a partner, a colleague, or a family member was embedded in a social micro-context that could generate counter-pressure. A partner who quietly said not to engage provided an external permission structure for noncompliance that short-circuited the internal normative pressure. Alone, the traveler had only their internal deliberative process to contend with the norm. Travelers who appeared financially comfortable were prioritized. So were those who appeared unhurried. A traveler running late for a connection possessed a socially legitimate exit from the encounter. Time pressure provided a non-norm violating reason to decline that required no reciprocity violation to deploy. A traveler with ample time at a gate or moving slowly through a concourse was a more vulnerable contact because the encounter could extend long enough for the normative pressure to build and produce a donation before a natural exit presented itself. The demographic targeting also reflected, according to accounts Rockford obtained from senior devotees, an empirically derived preference for travelers from northeastern and midwestern states over those from the south, and for those who appear to be in professional or business occupations. These preferences were never formalized as explicit categorical exclusions in surviving ISKCON documents, but they reflected the accumulated observation that certain demographic profiles produced higher donation rates than others. The effective result was that ISKCON's airport solicitation concentrated effort on middle-class professional adults traveling alone on business, the largest single demographic among domestic air travelers in the early 1970s. The revenues generated by this operation were institutionally transformative. James Richardson, a sociologist at the University of Nevada, Reno, who spent 2 decades studying new religious movements and published Money and Power in the New Religions in 1988, estimated that ISKCON's combined airport and street Sankirtana operations were generating between $15 million and $20 million annually by 1974. This estimate was constructed from a combination of financial records that entered the public domain through litigation, interviews with former ISKCON members, and extrapolations from organizational data available to researchers. The figure was consistent with estimates published in contemporaneous news reporting, including a 1976 Los Angeles Times investigation into ISKCON's financial operations. The most architecturally visible product of this revenue was the Prabhupada's Palace of Gold at New Vrindavan, West Virginia, an ornate temple complex begun in 1973 on a rural farm property that ISKCON had acquired in 1968 as the first of Prabhupada's intended rural communities. The palace was built almost entirely by devotee labor, financed through Sankirtana proceeds. Its decorative program included carved Italian marble flooring, inlaid gold leaf, European crystal chandeliers, and stained glass panels fabricated in Germany. Construction proceeded in phases through the 1970s, with the main structure dedicated at Prabhupada's birthday celebration in September 1979. When fully open to visitors, the complex attracted tens of thousands of tourists and pilgrims annually. The funding source for this structure was, in substantial part, the 3-cent carnations distributed at American airports. Prabhupada's correspondence with temple presidents through the early 1970s, portions published in the multi-volume Letters from Srila Prabhupada compiled by the Vaishnava Institute in 1987, consistently reframed the airport operation in devotional rather than commercial terms. Distributing flowers was an act of service to Krishna. The contact between devotee and traveler was an opportunity to plant a seed of spiritual awareness. The donation received was secondary. The primary good was the encounter itself. This theological framing served a concrete organizational function. It allowed devotees to sustain operational commitment through the social friction that the airport work inevitably generated. Travelers who expressed hostility, who returned the flower with. Visible contempt, who called the devotee a fraud. All such encounters could be reinterpreted through the theological lens as spiritually significant contacts rather than failures. The frame protected the workforce from the psychological costs of the job. By 1975, ISKCON's airport presence had generated sufficient public complaint and enough political pressure on airport authorities that several major airports and municipalities began pursuing legal mechanisms to restrict or eliminate the solicitation operations. The litigation that followed produced a body of First Amendment case law that remained influential in federal courts for 2 decades and ultimately required the Supreme Court of the United States to resolve a foundational question about the constitutional status of government-owned transportation facilities. The first significant legal confrontations occurred through 1975 and 1976, when airports including Los Angeles International, John F. Kennedy International, and several New England airports attempted to enforce terminal regulations prohibiting or restricting solicitation and distribution activities. Airport authorities generally characterized ISKCON's activity as commercial solicitation, the exchange of an item for a requested monetary contribution, and argued that airports were not public spaces in the constitutional sense, but rather commercial enterprises operated by government entities for transportation purposes, within which the sponsoring authority retained the right to exclude non-transportation activity. ISKCON mounted aggressive legal challenges to these exclusion attempts, represented in many proceedings by attorneys aligned with the American Civil Liberties Union, who took the cases on First Amendment grounds. ISKCON's central legal argument was that its airport activity, the distribution of religious literature and flowers as expressions of religious devotion, combined with solicitation of voluntary donations in support of the organization's charitable and religious mission, was protected expressive conduct under the First Amendment to the United States Constitution, and that airport terminals were public forums within which the government's ability to restrict speech was constrained by the strict scrutiny standard. The determination of whether a particular government-owned property constitutes a public forum, a space so historically associated with public assembly and speech that First Amendment protections apply with full force, is a constitutional determination that had been developing in Supreme Court doctrine since the 1939 decision in Hague v. CIO, in which Justice Owen Roberts articulated the principle that streets and parks had been used for assembly from time immemorial and could not be used as instruments for abridging constitutional rights. The extension of this doctrine to airports was genuinely contested. Airports were not parks or streets. They were purpose-built facilities with specific transportation functions, access to which was already commercially conditioned on purchase of a ticket or the accompaniment of a ticketed traveler. The United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit, addressing regulations imposed by multiple airports within its jurisdiction through the late 1970s and early 1980s, generally held that airport terminals or significant portions thereof constituted public forums or designated public forums within which restrictions on speech and solicitation were subject to heightened constitutional scrutiny. An International Society for Krishna Consciousness versus Berger, decided in 1981 and addressing regulations at Baltimore Washington International Airport, the Ninth Circuit held that ISKCON's solicitation activity was protected expressive conduct and that the airport's restrictions did not satisfy the applicable constitutional standard. This decision, in parallel Ninth Circuit rulings in earlier cases, largely protected ISKCON's airport presence through the period of maximum operational scale from 1973 through 1983. The wilted flower exemption that Robert Cialdini specifically references in Influence arose from a somewhat distinct legal context. Several airports had attempted to restrict ISKCON's flower distribution not on solicitation grounds, but on the grounds that the distribution of flowers constituted the distribution of merchandise within the terminal, a category of activity prohibited under airport commercial regulations designed to protect licensed concessionaires from competition by unlicensed vendors and to maintain orderly commercial operations in the terminal. If flowers were merchandise, their distribution required a commercial license that ISKCON did not hold. ISKCON's legal response to the merchandise distribution theory was to argue that the flowers were not merchandise, but gifts, property transferred to recipients without commercial transaction, as an expression of religious devotion. This argument succeeded in several administrative and judicial proceedings. The wilted flower element entered the legal record in at least one proceeding. The specific case identifier has not been definitively established in the published appellate record, suggesting it may have been a district court or airport administrative hearing decision that did not generate a published opinion, in which the airport authority attempted to characterize ISKCON's flowers as having sufficient commercial value to bring them within the merchandise regulation, and ISKCON argued in response that the flowers distributed were often past their commercial prime, wilting, browning at the petal edges, no longer saleable through normal commercial channels at any positive price, and therefore could not reasonably be characterized as merchandise within the meaning of the regulation. The argument was accepted. The wilted flower distribution was held to constitute a protected expressive act rather than commercial distribution, and ISKCON retained the right to continue the operation. The practical significance of these accumulated legal victories was substantial for the operational structure of the airport work. A legal environment in which airport teams could work without risk of arrest or immediate ejection by security personnel allowed the teams to operate with the deliberate pace and calm consistency that the reciprocity technique required. A devotee conducting the encounter under threat of imminent police intervention would have been a less effective practitioner of the four-phase sequence. Legal protection normalized the encounter from the devotee's side, allowing the full choreography, approach, gift placement, normative lock, solicitation, refusal of return, to proceed at its optimal pace. Airport authorities that could not exclude ISKCON outright attempted to constrain its operations through alternative regulatory mechanisms. Several airports designated specific zones within terminals in which solicitation was permitted while excluding it from the remainder of the terminal. This zone restriction effectively removed ISKCON teams from the highest traffic gate areas and main concourses, limiting them to lobbies and baggage claim areas where traveler dwell time was shorter and purposefulness higher, conditions less favorable to the extended encounter the technique required. O'Hare International Airport, administered by the Chicago Department of Aviation in the late 1970s, attempted a more sophisticated regulatory approach. A permit allocation system under which solicitation rights within the terminal would be distributed by lottery or rotation among multiple qualifying religious and charitable organizations. The intended effect was to dilute ISKCON's presence by requiring it to share terminal access with competing organizations and to introduce operational unpredictability into ISKCON scheduling. ISKCON challenged this permit system on the grounds that the allocation mechanism gave airport administrators discretion to prefer some expressive activity over others based on content and viewpoint, which constituted impermissible discrimination under the First Amendment. The litigation over the O'Hare permit system continued through 1979 without final appellate resolution, leaving ISKCON's access to the terminal in a contested but operationally viable state throughout the period of peak operations. The accumulated legal battles consumed significant ISKCON resources, attorney fees, court costs, organizational management time, but also generated a form of institutional legitimacy. Each successful court ruling affirming ISKCON's right to be present in airports was a public document establishing that the activity had been found to constitute constitutionally protected religious expression. This legal standing helped ISKCON counter the characterization, increasingly prevalent in press coverage and public discourse by the late 1970s, that its airport operations were a form of organized exploitation dressed in religious garb. Robert Cialdini's formal engagement with the ISKCON airport operation as a subject of social psychological research grew from a specific methodological dissatisfaction with the state of compliance research in the early 1970s. The dominant approach to compliance and persuasion research in American social psychology had been established primarily through the Yale Communication and Attitude Change Research Program, led by Carl Hovland during the late 1940s and 1950s. Hovland's group, which included Irving Janis and Harold Kelly, co-authors with Hovland of the 1953 landmark Communication and Persuasion, had developed a rigorous experimental tradition focused on identifying the characteristics of messages, sources, and audiences that determined whether a persuasion attempt would succeed in changing attitudes. The fundamental model was linear. A message is received, an attitude changes or does not change, and the changed attitude guides subsequent behavior. Cialdini found himself increasingly skeptical that this attitude change framework was adequate to explain the compliance phenomena he encountered during his early field observations. The specific problem was that many compliance techniques he observed in sales training, fundraising, and organizational contexts appeared to produce behavioral change without producing attitude change. People agreed to things they did not want, purchased things they did not value, donated to causes they did not support. Their attitudes toward the seller, the charity, or the cause had not shifted, but their behavior had. The Hovlandian model had no mechanism for this gap. It required attitude to mediate behavior, and here attitude and behavior were demonstrably dissociated. Cialdini's alternative framework, developed through the 1970s and published in Influence, The Psychology of Persuasion in 1984, positioned compliance as frequently operating through the triggering of specific social norms or cognitive heuristics rather than through the modification of underlying attitudes. The key theoretical claim was that humans maintain a repertoire of behavioral scripts, automatic response sequences tied to specific social stimuli that can be activated without engaging the deliberative processes that normally govern consequential decisions. The ISKCON carnation operation was the cleanest available field demonstration of this mechanism, because the gap between attitude and behavior was so large and so consistently observed. Targets who donated while simultaneously expressing hostility, irritation, and explicit awareness of being manipulated were providing natural experiment evidence that the behavioral and deliberative systems were processing the encounter through separate channels. Cialdini's methodology at airports was systematic. He trained research assistants to observe solicitation encounters from positions that did not signal an observational role, and to record specific elements of the interaction sequence: the approach angle, the moment of physical gift placement, the target's initial behavioral response, the devotee's response to expressions of resistance, the target's response when a return was refused, and the final behavioral outcome, donation or non-donation, and estimated donation amount when observable. This observational data was supplemented by structured interviews with ISKCON devotees willing to discuss the operational rationale for specific procedural elements, and by informal post-encounter conversations with airport travelers who had just experienced the technique. The four-phase operational sequence that Cialdini's observations identified was consistent across different devotees at different airports, indicating that the technique had been standardized through internal transmission, experienced devotees training newer members, rather than improvised individually. The first phase was the approach and gift presentation. A devotee would position in a moderate traffic corridor and select a target using the demographic and behavioral screening criteria described previously. The approach was typically from the front or angled side, establishing eye contact before the target had time to construct an avoidance response. The carnation was placed in the target's hand with a brief verbal frame. "This is a gift from us," or "we would like you to have this." The verbal framing was operationally critical. It designated the item as a gift before the target had fully processed what was happening, preempting the interpretation of the flower as a sales sample or a commercial enticement that could be declined on commercial grounds. The second phase was what Cialdini described as the normative lock. Once the target held the flower, the psychological cost of returning it had elevated significantly. The injunctive norm against rejecting a gift, a norm specifying what one ought to do, as distinct from a descriptive norm reflecting what people typically do, generated the discomfort that Goldner had described in 1960 as indebtedness. A majority of targets chose to resolve this discomfort through compliance rather than through norm violation. The injunctive norm against ingratitude is, in Goldner's structural analysis, one of the most foundational norms in human social organization because it protects the mutual benefit structure on which cooperative life depends. Violating it triggers feelings that function as social pain, embarrassment, shame, the anticipation of negative evaluation by observers. Even in the absence of observers, even when the target and the devotee were effectively alone in a terminal corridor, these feelings activated because the enforcement mechanism was internal as well as social. The third phase was the request for reciprocation. After a brief interval during which the target had established clear physical possession of the flower, the devotee introduced a request for a monetary donation. The framing of this request was deliberately calibrated to avoid explicitly theological language. ISKCON devotees in this period were instructed to frame the donation request in terms of charitable function, to support our food distribution program, to help us feed hungry children, rather than in terms of Krishna consciousness or Veda tradition. The charitable framing was more broadly effective across the target population, which included travelers who were resistant to religious solicitation but responsive to a humanitarian appeal. The fourth phase, which Cialdini identified as the most operationally sophisticated element of the entire technique, was the management of refusal, specifically the refusal of attempted flower returns. Targets who attempted to give back the carnation and exit the encounter were met by a consistent response. The devotee declined to accept the returned flower. Verbal framings included, "No, please keep it. It is our gift to you, and we give this freely. There is no obligation." The functional effect of this refusal was to prevent the primary behavioral exit route from a normative lock. If the flower could be returned, the exchange was dissolved, the reciprocity norm was deactivated, and the target was released. By refusing the return, the devotee maintained the normative binding while simultaneously, through the verbal framing of no obligation, appearing to relieve it. The contradiction was the mechanism. The flower remained in the target's possession, the norm remained active, and the verbal assurance of no obligation was insufficient to override the behavioral pull of a gift that could not be returned. Ellen Langer, a social psychologist at Harvard University, had been independently documenting in laboratory settings what she termed mindlessness, the tendency of humans to respond to social stimuli through automatic pattern matching rather than deliberative evaluation. Langer's 1978 paper in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, titled "The Mindlessness of Ostensibly Thoughtful Action," demonstrated that subjects in a copy machine queue complied with a request to let someone skip ahead at substantially higher rates when the request was accompanied by the word "because," regardless of whether the reason given was substantive or trivially circular. The presence of a compliance-relevant linguistic marker was sufficient to activate automatic compliance without engaging evaluation of the reason's actual merit. The ISKCON technique was a field-scale demonstration of an analogous principle. The presence of a gift activated a compliance script without requiring the target to evaluate the gift's value, the organization's legitimacy, or the request's justification. The trigger was the flower in the hand. The rest followed automatically. Cialdini's analysis positioned the ISKCON case as evidence for what he called rule-based compliance, compliance that operates through the automatic triggering of a social norm rather than through rational persuasion or attitude change. This framing had consequences that extended well beyond ISKCON. It repositioned the reciprocity norm as a mechanism of automatic behavioral control capable of overriding deliberative resistance. And it provided the ISKCON airport case as the most ecologically valid field demonstration of this mechanism available in the compliance literature. By 1977, the Hare Krishna airport flower operation had achieved the unusual status of a widely recognized cultural phenomenon in American public life. Coverage in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, and multiple regional publications had described the technique in considerable detail. Television news programs had featured footage of devotees approaching travelers at major terminals. A 1977 advisory published by the New York City Department of Consumer Affairs specifically warned travelers at John F. Kennedy International and LaGuardia Airport about organizations that present unsolicited gifts and subsequently solicit donations, naming ISKCON by organization name. Consumer protection offices in Chicago and Los Angeles issued similar advisories through 1977 and 1978. The general public had been told, with reasonable accuracy, what was happening and why it worked. The central question raised by this public awareness, whether knowledge of a compliance technique is sufficient to neutralize it, was directly addressed by Cialdini in Influence and had been the subject of experimental investigation throughout the 1970s. The protective assumption commonly held by both researchers and the general public was that exposure to a manipulation technique provides immunity. This assumption drew theoretical support from Jack Brem's 1966 theory of psychological reactance, the motivational state that arises when a person perceives that their freedom of choice is being threatened, producing pressure to restore the threatened freedom through noncompliance, and from research on forewarning effects, including Jonathan Friedman and David Sears's 1965 study in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, demonstrating that targets warned in advance of an impending persuasion attempt showed greater resistance than those who were not warned. The ISKCON case did not conform to this protective model. Traveler surveys conducted by researchers at several universities through 1977 and 1978, data cited by Cialdini in Influence, found that a substantial majority of travelers at major American airports could accurately describe the ISKCON carnation technique, including the refused return phase, and yet donation rates did not decline in proportion to awareness rates. Travelers who identified the organization on site, who knew the flower was an instrumental gift rather than an expression of genuine goodwill, who could articulate the psychological mechanism in informal but accurate terms. A significant portion of these travelers still donated. Awareness, in other words, was not protective at the scale and consistency the reactance model would have predicted. This finding was theoretically significant and has been elaborated by subsequent research within what became the dual process framework of cognitive psychology. Richard Petty and John Cacioppo, in their elaboration likelihood model developed through the late 1970s and formalized in their 1986 book Communication and Persuasion, Central and Peripheral Routes to Attitude Change, had distinguished between central route processing, deliberative evaluation of message content, and peripheral route processing, response to cues and heuristics without substantive evaluation. The reciprocity norm in this framework was a peripheral cue operating through the heuristic gifts require reciprocation. Awareness of the manipulation operated through the central route. The two routes processed in parallel, and the peripheral cue was not automatically neutralized by central route recognition because the two processing streams did not interact in a way that allowed deliberative judgment to reliably override automatic compliance. Daniel Kahneman's 2011 synthesis in Thinking, Fast and Slow, drawing on decades of research by Kahneman himself, Amos Tversky, and dozens of others working in behavioral economics and cognitive psychology from the 1970s forward, provided the most widely accessible framework for this phenomenon. Kahneman's System 1 and System 2 distinction formalized what Cialdini had been arguing empirically. Fast, automatic, associative processing, and slow, deliberative, effortful processing operate simultaneously but not in tight coordination. The recognition that one is being manipulated through a gift and request sequence is a System 2 judgment. The behavioral pull of the reciprocity norm is a System 1 response. System 2 can override System 1 when it is operating with full attention and explicit countermanding instruction. But under the conditions of airport transit, distracted attention, mild ambient time pressure, social noise, the physical experience of carrying luggage, System 2 was rarely operating at full suppressive capacity. The carnation caught people in exactly the cognitive state in which automatic processing dominates. ISKCON's airport operations declined through a convergence of external legal pressure and internal organizational crisis, rather than through any single precipitating event. Abhay Karanavina Swami Prabhupada died in Vrindavan, India, in November 1977, after a period of declining health during which he had continued to direct ISKCON operations through correspondence. His death created a succession crisis that the governing body commission, the 12-member Leadership Council Prabhupada, had established in 1970 and designated in 1977 to continue the movement's governance after his passing, could not cleanly resolve. The GBC designated 11 regional successors as initiating gurus, a decision that fragmented institutional authority across 11 power centers rather than consolidating it in a single successor. By 1980, several of the 11 designated successors had been removed from their positions following serious allegations. The most extensively documented case was that of Keith Ham, known within ISKCON as Kirtanananda Swami Bhaktipada, the leader of the new Vrindavan community in West Virginia, whose construction had been financed substantially through airport carnation proceeds. Federal investigation into New Vrindavan, which had begun in the late 1980s, resulted in a 1991 conviction on federal racketeering charges that included mail fraud related to ISKCON fundraising operations. The conviction was overturned on appeal in 1996 on procedural grounds, and subsequent proceedings resulted in Kirtanananda Swami entering a guilty plea to a reduced charge in 1996. The new Vrindavan prosecutions were the most damaging single sequence of events to ISKCON's public reputation in the United States through the 1990s. The definitive structural constraint on the airport operation came from the Supreme Court of the United States. An International Society for Krishna Consciousness Incorporated v. Lee decided in June 1992, the court addressed Port Authority of New York and New Jersey regulations prohibiting repetitive solicitation of money within airport terminals. The court held 5-4 in an opinion authored by Chief Justice William Rehnquist that airport terminals are not traditional public forums subject to the First Amendment protections applicable to streets and parks. Under the non-public forum analysis, the Port Authority's solicitation prohibition needed only to be reasonable and viewpoint neutral, a substantially less demanding constitutional standard than strict scrutiny. The regulations were upheld. On the same day, in the companion case Lee versus International Society for Krishna Consciousness, the court unanimously struck down the Port Authority's prohibition on the distribution of literature in the terminal, holding that literature distribution was too historically central to protected First Amendment activity to be excluded even from a non-public forum. The practical result was that ISKCON retained the right to distribute books and flowers, but lost the right to solicit monetary donations within airport terminals. Because the carnation operation required both elements, the gift distribution and the solicitation. Removing the solicitation dissolved the technique at its operational core. Robert Cialdini's Influence, The Psychology of Persuasion, published in 1984, ensured that the ISKCON airport case would outlast the operation itself as the canonical reference point in the compliance and persuasion literature. The book accumulated a large and durable readership through business and management channels over the following decades. Its adoption into MBA curricula at Stanford, Harvard Business School, and Wharton through the late 1980s and 1990s meant that the ISKCON carnation case was introduced as a foundational example of norm-based compliance to several 100,000 business school students across a 15-year period. Noah Goldstein, Steve Martin, and Cialdini extended the analysis in 50 scientifically proven ways to be persuasive in 2008, and Cialdini returned to the reciprocity mechanism in persuasion, a revolutionary way to influence and persuade. In 2016, developing the concept of persuasion, establishing the normative context for a request before the request itself is made, in a framework within which the ISKCON carnation was a historically clear early example. The ISKCON airport operation holds a specific and non-replicable place in the history of social psychology. It was not a laboratory experiment. It was not a theoretical model. It was a naturally occurring field compliance operation, run at institutional scale across a decade, generating tens of millions of dollars in aggregate donations, and observed in real time by one of the field's most consequential researchers during the period in which that researcher was constructing the theoretical framework that would shape applied persuasion research for the following 40 years. The conditions of the observation: uncontrolled environment, genuine adult targets with real financial stakes, operators motivated by both theological conviction and revenue requirements, evolutionary and social norms calibrated by millennia of human cooperative exchange, gave the data an ecological validity that no laboratory study of comparable design could replicate. What Dennis Reagan had demonstrated with a Coca-Cola in a Cornell laboratory in 1971, ISKCON was demonstrating with a coronation at every major American airport, at institutional scale, year after year. And what Cialdini observed and documented established, with greater real-world validity than any prior research in the compliance literature, that the reciprocity norm is not a preference, not a disposition, not an attitude. It is a behavioral constraint, one that operates whether or not the subject understands it, whether or not the subject approves of it, and whether or not the subject intends to comply. That was the 1971 Hare Krishna airport operation, documented by Robert Cialdini. From Offline, Connected Overnight. Sleep well or carry on.